Hi, I'm Corbin Fry. Welcome to BTV's World War II documentary, World War II, A Time for Heroes. Throughout the years of 1939 and 1945, the world was engulfed with the greatest war man has ever seen. We now know it as World War II. Throughout the war, many lives were lost and heroes made. This documentary tells their stories. As victory over Hitler and the Nazis was achieved, Americans had a difficult choice to make. With the passing of President Roosevelt, Harry Truman would be the man to make the decision to end the war with the atomic bomb and save many American lives. In this chapter, veterans reflect on their personal experiences, opinions, and what they believe all Americans can learn from World War II in hopes that history will never repeat itself.
When you looked down on it and you saw the devastation, it was most of it was gone. You know, there were 37 buildings left in Hiroshima. They were I didn't know much about it at the time that I photographed it. Later on, I read in the books that those 37 buildings were concrete steel reinforced. I did not know that they were all cracked to pieces and that there were thousands of people that were in those buildings that lived through that devastation, that if they were not standing by a window, or if they didn't get hit by a brick or cut by glass or hit by a ray of the bomb, they lived and didn't get radiation poisoning. Whereas if they were on the street and got hit by the rays of the bomb, they were either vaporized or received radiation poisoning. If they were directly under the bomb, where it was 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit, they were completely vaporized. That's the temperature of the surface of the sun, so they didn't survive. If they were 2 miles away and got hit by a ray of the sun, they received radiation poisoning and blisters. And
when the war ended on May 9th, 1945, we got sent up to Berlin, and we built the Allied power up there. That was to set up the Russians, the French, the British, and the United States. All of them to control how they were going to divide it up and everything. They divided up into 4 sectors. So we had German prisoners up there. We used to get them to work with us, you know, and then we had to tell them what we want done and everything else, and they worked with us. And they were very glad because we treated them good anyway. I mean, we didn't treat them mean or anything. I never did. And none of the other guys did either. And when I got stationed up there in Berlin, I was there for about 3 months, I think. And a month before I got ready to come home, my brother, my older brother, the one I met on the Rhine, got stationed up there too, a mile from me. So we got together again. It was the second meeting I had with him. And then I got discharged, came back to the States, landed in New York Harbor, and had a boat coming to greet us with girls on it, waving, and we were all excited. We said, girls. We got all excited about it. But anyway, I went to Camp Kilmore, New Jersey. That's where I got discharged from. I lived in New York at that time on my dog tags. I think you saw that.
On December the 20th, 1944, we got orders to remove all insignia from our uniform and go home. And I had left the farm. I was living on a farm and went to this exciting life. And it was a big disappointment to find out that I had to go back to that life. So when I came home from the military, I put all my uniforms and things that I had in the attic and forgot that life and went on with a regular life.
I can remember very vividly that all at once we heard on the radio the war was over. And we had an announcement in there, everybody will go at 10 o'clock to fight line and put all your dress clothes. Put on all your dress clothes. And the Colonel Twining, who was our general for the 15th Airport, was going to fly in here, and we were all lined up. We all had, each of our squads had to be lined up in here, and we were all in route dress. We didn't care about uniform. We didn't put our ties. We had our ties on backwards. And so we all sat there, and he flew in the airplane, went by, and we had to march in review, and we didn't even, you know, how the cadets, we used to march in precision and all of that. And you see, we were route step and walk to, and we went on it great. And all we had to do is, how quick can we get home? That's all we had. And the colonel who was the head of our squadron, put himself on orders, took his crew, took the best plane he had, flew it home. The lieutenant colonel was here. He was here a week or two, put himself on orders, he went home. And so we were sitting waiting for 2 months. And so I got somebody to put me on order to go to the Riviera. And we went on a plane up there in R&R, a rest camp. We stayed in the beautiful Carlson Hotel for a week. And we called back and said, we have orders to go home? No. So we skipped the next plane up there on purpose and stayed there another week. We got back and we're still there. War was over. They couldn't get us home fast enough. And so I went over to Rome for about 4 days, got back. Then I went over to Capri for 3 days, and finally I got a note. And then no planes left to fly back. And I went on another Liberty ship all the way home. And that's just long time consuming, not any fun.
I said, I love you, I think you're great, but arrivederci, I'm leaving. And I came home. And the interesting thing was, he talked about music. I got on a convoy to go back to the staging area, and as I got off and the truck was pulling out, they were playing I'll Be Home for Christmas, August 25th. And I said, man, that couldn't be. I mean, August, and I'll be home for Christmas. I got home on December 24th.
When you're 18 years old, you don't think anything can hurt you. And when you get older, you find out that isn't true. And I think that's why the young people fight the wars, because the older people, they don't have the, I don't know, I wouldn't say courage, but they know what the consequences are. And war isn't fun, I'll tell you. We had planes shot down even after the war. And then when we were on Saipan, there were Japanese up in the hills, and they were taking pop shots at us because they didn't know the war was over. Matter of fact, I think 10 years later or 20 years later, one man came down out of the hills and he didn't know the war was over. I mean, they had no communication.
We were getting ready to go make a landing on Japan. They were training for a landing on Japan. And when we were in a big tent city, must have been 1,000 tents in there, I guess. And there was a radio station up on the hill, just 100 yards, 200 yards away from where we were at. That's relaying the information from when MacArthur signed a peace treaty up there on the name of the ship. I forget the name of the battleship. It was the battleship where they did that. He signed that, and this was relaying the message back to Washington. And then the first thing you know, the first tent was informed of that, and man, the people hollered and yelled. It was wee hours of the morning. It must have been about 1 o'clock or so. Every tent relayed that down, went on down, right on. Everyone you could hear the same burst of heaven. So that was really a great day. Went downtown Honolulu the next day, and that downtown Honolulu was just a sea of humanity down there. Oh, everything, all the cars and everything had been stopped. People were running up and kissing the girls, and it was real. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that sight.
And it just so happened that I was home on the 72-day delay en route, that's just so I could get recuperated. And it just so happened that the war ended August 14th, and that was before I had to go back to service. I had to go back to service in September of '45. So the war was over. The war was over in Europe while I was over there in the prison camp, and then the war in Pacific got over with by the time I was ready to go back to service. I went back in September '45, and then the last part of November '45 I was discharged to come home.
We went into Berlin, and all these Russians was in there then, and I didn't feel safe in there at all, so we took off and headed back, and I found the Red Cross place, and they looked through the records and everything, found out my brother had already left back to the States.
I don't remember the date that VE Day came, but that was more dangerous than any of the war I was in because the troops was absolutely wild. But anyway, as soon as the war was over, they began to ready the troops that did not have enough points because they had not been in the European theater of war as long as the rest of them had. The ones that had the most points were allowed to come home, and they began to get all the other troops ready to go to the South Pacific. And I was in that group. I had my duffel bag packed and was ready to go. I don't remember what the group was, but we were ready to go to the South Pacific. And they came out again and called my name and said, "We want you to become a first sergeant over an ordnance company here that will stay in Germany." And I went into this ordnance company as first sergeant and stayed in Germany all during the summer of 1945 until the war was over in Japan, until they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Our duty, among many other things, as first sergeant, my job was to get the paperwork ready for the soldiers that were coming back from the European theater of operation. And also we transported the thousands and thousands of displaced persons that were in concentration camps. All kind of people that were prisoners of war, and we had to get them back from one place to another. I came back to the States in January of January 1946. I was discharged from the Army as a rank of first sergeant, January 26, 1946.
I was working the desk here at Smithfield when a call came in saying that Japan was about to surrender, and they had some leaflets to drop. Now, you got to remember, we didn't have radios in the cars. There was no television at that time. And actually, the newspapers in Fort Wayne was on strike. So the only way that we could get the news out was to drop these leaflets over Fort Wayne saying Japan surrendered. I did get FAA's, or it was CAA at that time, permission to drop them over the city of Fort Wayne, and I had that privilege. I didn't think it was so much of a thing that I didn't even save a copy of it. It wasn't until about the 50th anniversary when they started talking about it, it came back into my memory.
They must have all talked about what they were going to do when they came back. Shortly after my father returned, we bought a place in the country with a few acres and started raising chickens and cows and stuff like that. But I do know that the war marked him, even though he was not in a unit that got heavily shelled or heavily shot at or anything like that. And I can only imagine what it must have been like for the ones that were in close combat, like the infantry. And I can only imagine how it must have affected them and why they woke up still screaming years later, you know, because he had flashbacks too. And I think Sherman was right when he said war's out.
I was glad to get home, I know that. I'd spent 23 months over there, so I was glad to get out.
I sent my mother a telegram saying I'll be home such and such a day. So when I started, I didn't know where she was because she had moved to a different location. When I started walking down the street where I thought I knew where I was coming, she saw me from outside, well, up where it was her window, and she says, "Oh, some soldier's going home from overseas or something, you know?" And here I was looking for her, you know, and she didn't realize it was me. Of course, it had been some time, it's almost 3 years since I seen her, you know, so.
Of course, I was glad to get out. I got out on Christmas Day of 1945. Yeah, 1945. I was here at Camp Atterbury. And because my folks were, that was the closest that they could get to me to discharge me to my folks, which lived in South Bend, Indiana. And so I went to Atterbury and they discharged me on Christmas Day. The reason they did, there was an ice storm on the 24th and no one could leave the camp. The trains, the buses and everything were shut down for overnight until they could get things opened up. So they said, well, we got the men here and we got the people to discharge them. Let's get this group cleared out. And as soon as they can get way home, why, they can go. So I picked up a ride with a soldier that he had people right here in Bloomington, and my wife and my baby were waiting for us up at the hotel. And I got here and saw my baby that was a year and 5 days old when I saw him. And I saw him just about 15 minutes before Christmas was over with.
Finally got my discharge paper and went to Great Lakes, and then I again got to Great Lakes 2 or 3 days earlier, and again I did the same thing, ushering the people up and making sure they got on the right ship and different things, you know. Then my day finally come, and I went to Evansville and got my discharge papers. That was it. I was mustered out in Great Lakes.
When the Germans surrendered, it was in the spring, and I was just getting out of gunnery school, and I was still looking forward to the time when I would go over and fight the Japanese. And when I was, I made it to Lincoln, Nebraska to crew up in a B-29 on the 15th of July, 1945. And I was looking so forward to flying in the B-29 and being able to control 4 gun turrets with the world's only computerized gun system where with a push of a button I could control 4 gun turrets and aim at 1 fighter plane coming in toward the B-29. And 2 weeks and a few days later, the Japanese, we dropped the atomic bombs. And of course I never got my first flight in a B-29. That was my only disappointment, was that I didn't get to fly in the B-29, but I was greatly relieved that we did not have to fight the Japanese, because I knew they were very tough and extremely cruel fighters.
Well, of course, I had been called by the WGL to drop the leaflets, so my first concern was we had the leaflets in the airplane. In fact, we had 2 J3 Cubs, and we had 56,000 leaflets tucked around in it, and one of the mechanics rode with me and helped dig out these things and drop them. Of course, I was happy that the war was over.
If it hadn't been for American forces, we would either all be dead or be speaking Japanese or German, very likely.
In fact, George Patton and General Eisenhower didn't get along, or Patton wasn't paying attention to it. He was hard to control, but he won the war in Europe quicker than any other man.
President Roosevelt died about two or 3 months before the end of World War II in Europe, and that was a sad time for our country. But General Eisenhower and General Bradley and of course General Patton are big heroes in my mind. Eisenhower, who became president later, of course, and I've always been a big fan of President Eisenhower. And General Patton, who was very controversial, if you know about him, he couldn't keep his mouth shut a lot. He said things that he shouldn't, and he got in trouble. And of course, Eisenhower even pulled him out of combat in Africa and took him to England, and wasn't going to give him any kind of a command because of things that he had done. But then he needed him then, and then put him back in combat in France. And when he went into France, he was told just to hold into southern France. Man, he just started marching, and he had marched all the way to Metz when we joined him. You know, that's clear on the other side of France. So he didn't believe in sitting, and he didn't believe in retreat. So he was, like I said, he was controversial, but he got the job done.
I hadn't personally stood up in front of Patton before, but like I was telling you there, we broke through at Metz. He made this big speech and made us pile up all these books we had, translation books, and give us that big speech about killing them, and we broke through there. No, old Patton, he was something else. I went down to Fort Knox 3 or 4 years ago. See, our old outfit, what's left of us, we have reunions every year, and we had one down there at Fort Knox, and we went up through there. And that's Patton Museum down there, and after you get so far through there, why, that old '39 Cadillac LaSalle that he got, which I think CID and OSS worked him over. But anyhow, it's there, and somebody had carved out out of balsam wood a statue of him. And they all looked just like him, you know. They walked up there and looked at him.
Well, Patton was a great leader.
Well, I think General Eisenhower.
Why?
Well, he was the supreme Allied commander, and we won the war, so I think he's without a doubt the main guy.
Oh, I think Eisenhower and MacArthur both. I saw MacArthur in Manila, but I never did see Eisenhower, of course, because I was in the other theater. But I think both of them were excellent men.
Well, I think Eisenhower and MacArthur, and there were several of the big generals. I can think of all their names. A lot of the four-star generals that were commanders in all different parts of the war, and they did a great job and carried out their mission, you know, with pride and glory, and also they were fighting for a cause also, for their country and for the love of it, you know, for our freedom.
Well,
Patton, I think, was very good. MacArthur was a good general, except he was, his ego sometimes got in the way of the successes.
Well, I would say the administrative part would be MacArthur or Eisenhower. But the one in the field, I would think, would be, well, so many different ones that you can't say, can't say who the names would really be right offhand. But there were a lot of good ones.
Patton wouldn't obey orders. He knew where he was at, he knew what he wanted to do, and he knew what he wanted to accomplish, and he got it done. But Eisenhower didn't give him the orders always. They got in a big argument one time about Patton not obeying the orders. But after all was said and done, they were still friends.
General Eisenhower was the head of the American war in Europe, and I would have to say that Eisenhower and General Marshall, who was Chief of Staff, and also Churchill were the great leaders of that war.
The Japanese had trained their civilians as well as military to fight with pitchforks, knives, whatever, for any kind of an invasion. They knew the American invasion was inevitable. And it was estimated that millions would have been lost on both sides, or at least thousands. And so I'm sure the atomic bombs saved many, many lives on both sides. And I think the Japs would have held out as long as they could if the bomb hadn't been dropped until the invasion was inevitable. It would have happened.
Yes, I do. The simple reason was that atomic bomb probably saved 10, 15,000 lives. And of course the argument is it also took 10 to 15,000 lives, but if they'd have had it, it would have been us. We had it, it was them.
Well, I think it was a good thing, because if they had not used the atomic weapons in Japan, the ground forces would have had to go to Japan, and it would have taken maybe several years to conquer Japan, and it would have been millions more soldiers and civilians killed.
There had been rumors floating around, that there was a new weapon that was being developed. Most of us did not have enough information to know what it was. We took a lot of pride when Captain Jimmy Doolittle took his group of planes and was able to make a one-time stab of bombing Japan during the war. We thought that was very brave. My brother was in the Army, and at that time he was in a staging area at Okinawa, and we knew that that was a spot from whence the American troops would take off in the invasion of Japan. And so all of a sudden we got this news that there had been a bomb, a monstrous bomb that had exploded and destroyed a whole city and killed thousands of people. And the immediate question that came to our mind was not how terrible that was, but hey, maybe that's a step to winning a war and ending this thing of which we are a part. In retrospect, I think it was a positive thing towards ending what was a very bad war situation. Laterly, I watched the development of the atomic bomb as it was being exploded on the salt flats or in the West. And I thought it was amazing how devastating that power was. And I'm amazed knowing approximately how many we have in both the United States and Russia and in other areas of the world, the concentration of power and death-making devices that were available to us. A man in his foolishness could destroy that which God in his wisdom has created.
Yeah, I think it saved a whole bunch of lives, American lives anyway.
Well, it was a dreadful thing to have to do. But it probably saved 1 million lives by doing it. But that was very tragic circumstances. I don't see how the man made the decision to do it, but I don't think he had enough knowledge about how bad it was going to be. So, but it ended World War II. So when it ends the war, and you're going there to fight to see who can be the best man, you can expect things like that. But they learned by it. They haven't done it since.
So you would agree with it?
Well, I would agree with having to make the decision to do something to save lives. So, but I don't think that I could disagree with it since it ended the war.
Do you think that we should have tried to find an alternative to?
We were searching for alternatives all the time during the war. Whenever it was, we were trying to find out how we could have done it. And they had no mercy on us. Enemies fight one another.
I think they got what they deserve. Because look at the people there in December the 7th, which they slipped in there, and all these people were asleep. A lot of them getting ready to go to church and or eat breakfast, and come in there and well, they killed what 2,000 some people.
Sure, I think it saved lots of lives, a lot of American lives.
It was a terrible thing for them, but it was a lot of people say the bombs were terrible, and they were terrible, but it was a necessary thing. I believe that because the 2 bombs that we dropped were necessary to end the war. We didn't know we had planned 2 invasions of Japan, and one was to come in October and one was to come the following March. And had we invaded Japan, we did not know the terrible fate that would have been bestowed upon our soldiers should they land on Japan's land. We would have been in a very terrible, bloody battle. And we didn't know that we probably would have lost the very first battle and would have been bloodied beyond belief had we landed there.
We were, of course, I was in the Philippines at that time. I was with an infantry division because the infantry division has artillery units. And I was preparing for the invasion. And anyway, we thought it was an astounding situation, and of course, short-sightedly, you might say we welcomed it because it meant possibly that we wouldn't have to go into that invasion and we'd get home quicker and see our wife and children.
Yes, I did, because they were warned before it was dropped that they would drop a bomb that would cause mass destruction, and they should lay down their arms and surrender. And the first one, they hesitated. Then they dropped then they figured, well, if we drop another one and they surrender, we will save thousands and thousands of lives if we don't have to take Japan by the foot soldiers. And when we dropped the next bomb, Japan called it quits. And it saved all of those lives that we would have lost if we'd have had to take Japan by foot.
I felt they did the right thing when they dropped the bombs. So we was glad. I'll never forget. When my best friend come back and told me after the second bomb went off, he says, "Tom, we're going home." Come back and shut me and woke me up. He said, "This war has to be over. They can't take this." So I was glad of that too.
I thought it was a great idea.
So you approved it?
I did. I did then, and I do it now.
So do you think that if that bombing didn't occur, do you think?
We had to invade Japan, and I think the losses would have been much greater for both the Japanese and certainly for the Americans.
I suppose it was, as President Truman said, you know, it was a terrible thing, terrible thing. But maybe in the long run it was a good thing because fewer died. And so I wouldn't really know the answer to that. My husband expected to go then to Japan, but it turned out the war ended because of that. So who knows? You know, so many things are a matter of judgment. We don't know. But I hope we never have to have that anymore.
You never know what would have happened out in the South Pacific. Thank goodness for the bomb, because it probably saved my life as well as a million others.
I was glad they did, but because it stopped the war a whole lot quicker. But as far as the destruction that happened in Japan, I think that was necessary. I don't think they should have let up on the bombing or anything like that. I think it was necessary, and they shortened up the war quite a considerable amount.
Well, I was glad to see it happen, but it stopped me from getting to come home. We had got back, and we got back to Antwerp, Belgium, and we'd taken all the shots and was getting ready to come home, get a 30-day leave, and then go down to Texas and take some more amphibious training. And we were going to head to over to and make the invasion of Japan, but they dropped that bomb, so they surrendered.
The thought was that they could save many, many American lives by dropping the bombs and really closing Japan off. But was it real? Was it true that this would have happened? Here we killed over 100,000 Japanese as a result of that, and I don't know if the justification for dropping it was good or not, but it was done. The orders were given. They did it, and that's what war is about. You take the good. There is no good. It's all bad, whatever the solutions are.
Well, when they dropped the atomic bomb, it showed them that we wanted an end to it, and that we was getting toward losing lives, and we put it on the spot that we was going to stop this war one way or the other.
Well, we just put it off too long. That answers your question. If we could have done it earlier, I'd have said do it earlier.
It was a joyful moment because we were waiting to go to Japan when we were at Okinawa, and we knew that was going to be a wholesale slaughter. Might add, I was in a UPS line one day, and there was a gentleman back of me. This was a few years ago. He was deferred, about my age, and he was deferred for some reason or other. And back of him there was a young woman. And I was telling him my experience, and come to dropping the bombs. I always refer to them as the eggs. Dropping the bombs, and I said that was the best thing that ever happened. She got all distorted and bent out of shape. They should have never done it. It cost so many lives, and she had friends that was in it, and look at all the people that maimed and injured. Lady, I said, you must be a lot older than what you appear. Well, I had friends of friends that was in it. I said, well, it still saved more lives than it cost because it was going to be a wholesale slaughter. And when you're in war, it's either going to be you or me. And if I've got anything to do with it, it's going to be you. And she didn't say anything after that.
I know a lot of people thought dropping an atomic bomb was bad because we killed a lot of civilians, but we anchored down in Yokosuka And you could look into the hill and there'd be nothing but caves up in there, tunnels. And I felt that if we ever had a land at Tokyo or Yokohama or Yokosuka, that there'd be many, many people killed because they were infiltrated right into the ground. I mean, you couldn't get them out. I don't know if you ever heard of Okinawa. They bombed that place for weeks, and the Japanese went down into the burial places in the island, and our bombs didn't do any good, and the shelling didn't do any good. And when we landed there, my sister's girlfriend, her husband was the highest rated person left in his division. He was a corporal. Everybody else was killed or wounded. And we felt that if they landed in Japan, it would be the same thing.
I think that ended the war. I know it took a lot of lives, but I think it saved a lot of lives, because if our men would have went in there and them Japs would fight to the last person, it's awful hard to outfight a nationality of people. Like, we wouldn't have enough soldiers to outnumber their civilian population. And I know it's horrible, the atomic bomb is horrible, but I think it ended the war.
Well, at the time, we didn't really know that much about it. And we were told while we were on our way to Hiroshima that it had been dropped. But the full realization didn't penetrate. It didn't really hit us that hard until later we heard of the damage. And I think it's a terrible thing. But it shortened the war, I know. Because, as I say, we were supposed to go into Japan for occupation duty, which we didn't have to do.
He thought it was absolutely the right decision. I've never talked to, I can't recall any active military that fought in the war that ever really said we shouldn't have. It's a light estimate to think that we would only lose about 1 million people if we tried to invade Japan. They weren't going to just roll over and surrender. They were going to fight to the last, you know. There'd have been a lot worse than Hitler Youth. You'd have had kids running out and biting you on the ankle. I mean, those people weren't going to quit. But no, he had no problems at all with the bomb.
I was in favor of it. And I say to this day, I would be in favor of it. That's an instrument of war. We had gone through a lot in the 3.5 years, and we had a lot of casualties, and people were predicting if we had to invade Japan, we might lose as many as 1 million men. Well, who wants to lose 1 million men? I mean, men in their prime of life. We saw the 2 bombs wiped them out. So I think it was good military strategy. It would have been tough if we had received it, but we weren't the recipients. And so, sure, I'd do it again.
Hitler was a genius, but he was an idiot. And you put the two together and you got big problems. He had no allegiance to anyone other than himself. And he wanted to conquer the world. That was his primary goal. And I had a little something I was going to bring, but it doesn't mean anything. It's a little collar thing you wear on your collar, and it's got 2 little S's. It's called SS, the stormtroopers. And these were people who were sworn to die for Hitler. And they were always in the front of battles and everything else. And he used them well, too, including on his own people. Anybody that would try to cross him or not follow what he wanted, why, he'd just wipe them out.
Oh, boy, I think he's probably the worst man that ever lived.
Well, Hitler was a character to me. We read about Hitler a lot. It's hard in a remote situation to know ahead of time just how devastating he was. He had a war machine that was quite unique. his Air Corps, his submarine corps. Germany had a history, at least in my generation of time, of being a militant kind of group. We knew from what our press was feeding us that he was an irrational man, and those who were with him were irrational people. And I secretly was very happy when Himmler was, I believe his name was Himmler, was assassinated in Austria at the time. It was one of those things that you knew that, or you felt that this man was bad because of what you had been told. And I believe the history lessons that I have learned was that he was not really interested in the betterment of mankind, but he had some kind of warped idea as to what the utopian world would be like, and in my opinion it was very wrong.
He was a criminal type person, a wallpaper hanger, I guess. They say he was a wallpaper hanger. Don't really think very much of it, but I think I have no respect for most any of the things he tried to accomplish. He was wrong, and it was proven to be wrong. It's kind of like what we're facing now in Iraq.
I think he was crazy. You know, somebody that'd go and eliminate especially the Jewish population, and if you was a black person over there, your number was up. If they got you in the right place. But
an evil, twisted, sick person that somebody should have gotten to him a lot sooner, but would have saved the world a lot of trouble.
Well, he was a madman, and we haven't had many people on earth like him, and he certainly didn't deserve to have the chance to do all he did.
I think a lot of our soldiers and whatnot, the way he acted after where our outfit was over there, the way he acted, I think he was practically out of his mind, but he had just the urge to go on all the time and try to I think I don't know whether he realized that he was up against too much, but I think he was just partly out of his mind and just tried to push more and more.
If I could meet him, I'd stomp him. First thing, then I'd talk to him.
What would you say to him?
Get up and I'll do it again. He was a mean man. He treated his people terribly. We have the same thing going on in Iraq today.
My thought was that they never could win, even if it seemed they would on the end always lose, because bad people always lose.
I left this World War II behind, and we don't talk. My kids have never talked about it. Never talked about it. Very few people talk about it. This is the first time in 60 years anybody's ever asked me to come in and say, what did I do during World War II? I mean, we did it. It's something we had to do. And I think we did a pretty good job, and it's all over.
I think one of the highlights of my service was seeing the Japanese peace envoys land on the island I was on. They were told to come in white Betty bombers with a green cross painted on their sides so we wouldn't shoot them down. And there were 3 of them that had the peace envoys that, when they landed, were transferred to our planes and taken down to Manila to confer with General MacArthur. I guess that was one of the highlights of history that I saw.
It was Christmas Eve. I guess it was 1944. Yeah, it'd be 1944. And all along the way,
guys were setting up fires. You know, they got some logs or something, and they start fires. And because it was so cold, it was freezing cold, and I held my feet over because my foot was frozen, and I was trying to warm up my feet. I burnt the rubber right off. I was trying to keep them warm. My feet were so cold, but not actually burned it off, but I burnt holes in it, you know, so trying to keep my feet warm. It was the coldest I ever been.
We were back in the States, so we left England not long after President Roosevelt died. While we were in England, President Roosevelt died, and we got to go to a memorial service for him in Plymouth, England. Next day, we shipped out for home. We came back to South Atlantic, and some of you have heard of Ernie Pyle. When we were on our way home, a few days out of England, Ernie Pyle was killed over in the South Pacific, you know. So that's our first hearing about it was when we were coming home. Well, it took us about 18 or 19 days to get home, taking the South Atlantic route. We were zigging and zagging, and we got into Norfolk, Virginia, getting home one day, and the next day the Germans gave up, which was about the 5th of May or something like that. And so we had zigged and zagged all the way across the ocean. Didn't know what we were zigging and zagging about, but that was a thing we had to do at that time. The LST that I was on, I had the bow watch on all the way home. So one of the ship's crew from the LST and I were right up on the bow of the ship, which was about 60, 70 feet high. And the water was rough, and the motion sickness got us all, you know, and that thing would dip and it'd go way down here about 60 feet, and then about 2-3 seconds later it was up in the air about 60 feet, and this up and down all that way, and it lasted for 17, 18, 19 days. And I was seasick in the Navy every day that I was out on the water. That's the only thing I had that I didn't like about the Navy, was the water. And I didn't know that before I went in. It didn't take long to find out.
We were bombing Japan. That's really why they developed the B-29 bomber, to have a long-range bomber so they could bomb Japan. The Tokyo, which I got to visit on Liberty while we were there, was a ghost town. They had burned it. It was about a 4-block square section downtown of masonry buildings was all that was left. Everything else was destroyed. Majority of those buildings over there were what we would call tar paper buildings at that time. And our planes had fire bombed them. They'd set a fire and burn out a whole section of town at one time. You know, there was very little left in Tokyo.
Well, for one thing, England would have been overrun by Hitler if we hadn't gotten into the war. I'm sure of that. And there was even the possibility from that point on, there would have been bomb strikes and everything to the American coast, I think, from England when Hitler, after a time, if we hadn't been able to stop that.
So do you believe that the world would almost be totally ruled by Hitler and Germany?
I don't think Hitler would have won. I think we eventually would have you know, we would have had to invade England, just like we did France in D-Day, but it was a scary time, and I don't think, a lot of people don't realize, I don't think, how close England came to being overrun. Hitler stood there and looked at it and wanted to do it, but the Eastern Front with the Russians was so important to him at that point that he couldn't invade England.
Well, for one thing, it gave me an occupation. I got out of the war thinking I was going to be an aeronautical engineer, and I never dreamed I'd be a photographer. And I kept going back to photography, and I started dabbling in photography, and I couldn't I couldn't leave that magic that I seen, that picture come up in a tray of liquid. It was magic. You know, the first time in the service when I put a piece of blank paper in the tray of developer and there came the image, it was magic. And every time I did that, it was magic. Every time I went in the dark and stuck a piece of film in a tray of developer with the lights out, and when I finally turned the lights on and held it up and there was an image on there, I thought, hey, this is magic. It's really there, you know. And when I first put it in there, I thought, I said, God, let there be an image on here, you know. And it was. And then I'd print it, and there it was in the tray, and it was magic.
Can you imagine having 60 guys on a ward, or even 30, and they want to date you? Huh. The stories they could come up with. So I said, sorry, I just don't date patients. So he waited until it was his birthday. It was the 15th of November, mine was the 11th. And he bought me a 6-cent medal that I could wear. And he said, you know, I really don't, I want to go into town. I have nobody to go with. Big deal. But anyway, so I thought, well, what the heck, I'm leaving this ward anyway in a couple of days. So I went out with him. And then we just kind of got interested. So we got married, let's see, February 9th, after I was discharged.
It was a good experience for me. It taught me a lot about life, but I sure wouldn't want to go through it again.
We were in no Luftwaffe barracks up in there with the trees run right up through and up from the air. There's natural camouflage you couldn't see. But anyway, there was Wurzburg ball bearing factory, which I know my brother was in on bomb raids, bombing that. And they was up in the apple orchard there. There was a salt mine, and we'd go down there, and of course we had a lot of DPs, that's displaced persons, in around there. And we'd pull guard on that for a couple hours only. And they'd tell you, they'd give you a quart of booze until you get out of there, don't come back. But what they told us, it was a storage area for the Luftwaffe. And years after, I found out really what it was. It's all that gold and pictures and all kinds of valuable stuff, which was taken out of Berlin and hid down in there. And our people, we had special people that's all they trained in, was looking for stuff like it. And we got it all out of there, the Americans did, before the Russians.
Now, as I look back on it, I'm very proud that I had the opportunity to do it. And people are now finding them in grandparents' things that they've got in their picture boxes and things, and I'm getting copies of them.
A man like Hitler could just convert a whole nation to believing the way he did. And the Japanese, of course, they had their emperor, Hirohito, and they would do whatever his army people would tell him to do, and they did.
And the scientists in Germany, they knew how to develop the atomic bomb, but they intentionally refused to develop the bomb for Hitler. They didn't want to develop the bomb for Hitler, and so they intentionally made all kinds of mistakes so that they would not develop it for Hitler.
One thing he did tell me about that might be interesting, do you know what white phosphorus is? Mm-hmm. Okay. It's a nasty round. It burns. Pour water on it, it burns more. They used white phosphorus one time on his command. He was in charge of deciding what kind of rounds they used. And he came through the area that he had shelled, and he saw a small child that had been burned by the white phosphorus. He never used it again. He said, that's not a way to fight a war. so he never used it. I respected that.
But I come home D-Day, June the 6th. I got on the boat to come home. It was in 44. But so I come home for 32 days, and then I was down Seymour here a while, and then I went over to Columbus, Ohio, at the air base there, and finished. Well, I got out of the service. But I was figured I was lucky to be alive. That's about all I got to say.
One time I was on the radio after, it was at Christmas time, and when we were going to the Battle of the Bulge, I was on a radio and I got a code message, and it was General Patton saying, Merry Christmas to all the troops.
After the fighting was over, why they tried to have entertainment and things for the troops to do. So the certain divisions would make up football teams, and then they'd have like the stadiums where Hitler had built for the people to exercise in and all that. Well, they had pretty nice stadiums, so we'd play the football games in there. And at one time, I was fortunate enough to, at one of the football games, to Eisenhower and Patton both were on my side of the field, and just about 2 rows down and about 4 or 5 seats over. And of course, when it come to halftime, why they stood up and acknowledged the soldiers on that side, and they walked across the field to the other side, so that they would be half and half. And it was very interesting to see the two of them together. They were two completely different men, actually. Patton he was a good dresser, and he was a big man. Eisenhower was very neat and dressed good, but you could tell that Eisenhower was a whole lot more friendly towards the troops, and Patton took the time to be.
No, I did not feel like a hero because there were so many people that gave all my, and I could have been in some of those battles too. But when I failed that test up there, that was the thing that saved my life. I know it was. When I failed the test when I was in boot camp. And I just know that the Lord must have been with me. And he had me. Well, when it went back to that story where I was standing on the end of the fantail of the ship, and looking down and told him, and I said right then, I said, Lord, if I get out of this, I'll be forever your servant. And I really didn't think too much about that. But why would I having great joy when I got out? And I went to college at Purdue, graduated Purdue. That's a different story. I don't want to get into that. But, I got out, and it's always been a great blessing on me.
And actually, when we went back over there, the German people treated us like we was just the best visitors there was. And come to find out, they did think of us that way. They don't count us as captors. We were liberators. We liberated the German people from Hitler.
I also remember my chief radarman, his name was Blau. The Chatelaine was having problems with its radar. And we were in port in Halifax, Newfoundland, and so Blau said, Lieutenant, I think I can fix that radar. Why don't I go aboard the Chatelaine for this cruise, and I can rejoin the ship when we get to New York? And so I said, are you sure you want to do that? And his answer was, yeah, I'd like to do that. Ironically, he was one of the people that was lost on the Chatelaine when it was sunk about a week later.
We saw a lot of good people and some not so nice. But for the most part, we enjoyed. We saw a few German soldiers. They were lined up a bunch of them, I'd say 100, 150 of them on that floating pier, ready to go aboard an LST. They were prisoners. They were getting ready to be taken back to England. So we got to see and to speak to some of them that could speak English, you know. And we traded different things, you know. They liked candy bars. They didn't have any. And we had candy bars and cigarettes and so forth. So we traded a lot of this for what they had left. Belt buckles, helmets, this type of thing. So this is what we got into, and this is where I got some of the souvenirs that I got by trading.
I had a small Bible I had in my pocket, and as I was going through one place, I forget when I was first captured, one of the German guards, he was going to tear off that little metal thing. Another guard told him, "Nix, don't do it." I didn't have anything to hide, just a little New Testament my wife had given me. And
in my family, I had 3 cousins killed. I had a brother-in-law shot down over Hungary. I had a brother-in-law who had 2 ships shot out from under him. I had a cousin at the Battle of the Bulge. I had 2, they weren't direct cousins, but they were married, my cousins. They both were injured in the war. Well, when these people die, I don't know if anybody's even going to know about it. And I don't know if they teach history like that kind of history in school or not.
We had a lot of casualties.
Well, we were in the same exercise group over at the Y, and so he said to me, "Well, when did you go overseas?" And I said, "Well, I went in 1944 in November, and I went over on the Ile de France." He said, "Well, I went over on the Ile de France," and I said, "Well, we didn't have an escort. We zigzagged across." And he said, "Oh, we zigzagged across too." He said he went over on the Ile de France, and so then we figured out the dates and where we landed and so forth. So it was just coincidental. Then they came over and they took our pictures of us together. And I just saw him yesterday, and he came over to me and he put his arm around me. He said, "I want you to know today is a very, very special day." And I said, "Well, that's good. What should I do, help you celebrate?" He said, "Yes, it's my 55th wedding anniversary." So he gave me a hug.
I think the thing that was hard to accept from the time we're small children, we have problems, we go to somebody for help, and we know that there'll be help. We could have trouble along the road in a car, and we know that we go to a farmhouse, we run out of gas, and they'll help us. You know what I'm saying? And suddenly to realize that there's people there wanting to kill us. And just to accept the fact that there's actually somebody there will kill you if they can. And to accept that, it was kind of a hard thing to realize that there are actually people that are out there to kill you. And then, of course, seeing all the dead and the losses of the fine young men that I went overseas with in their late teens, early 20s. And if there's any honor, you know, the honor should go to those guys who are represented now only by white crosses in the cemeteries in Luxembourg and across the continent. We see, I guess, at this time of year, actually, we see a lot of honor given to the veterans who have survived, and of course they're the only ones who are available, but I always think of those boys that are just white crosses now.
You all know what that is, don't you? Well, this is an Indian good luck charm. Everybody says, "Well, that's a swastika." It is, but it was copied from the Indian good luck charm. And if you'll go out to Indiana University in the men's gym, and along the edge of the wall they have decorated with swastikas, because it was built before Hitler was a big deal, and that's what it is. We still have reunions, my fighter squadron. We meet every year, been doing this for the past 20 years, And we see my old buddies, we flew with, and some of them have passed away, and the numbers are getting shorter and shorter. So in a year or two, there won't be none of us left. I hope it's more than a year or two. We'll still be around.
When the war ended, we got to the Elbe River near when the war was just about ready to end, and the Russians didn't want us to come into to cross the Elbe. They held us up there, and they have a tank set up. And when I got up to Berlin, they have a tank set up there. They say the first Russian tank into Berlin. It was an American tank on Lend-Lease that they had sent over there to help the Russians when the Germans was raiding Russia there. And they had the Russian tank. But it was one of our tanks.
I heard stories of them getting shrapnel in the Bible, and they found it pointing to a certain scripture. I've heard that story. And the bullet didn't penetrate the Bible. The good Lord withstood the shot.
Well, maybe I should qualify this since I said I was now a pacifist under the conditions now. I certainly wasn't then with Pearl Harbor showing what the Japanese were going to do. I feel that I am a patriot because I volunteered to go into the service. I've given 29 years of my life in the service. And I want to do all I can to protect our country. But I don't have to agree with the present administration's. I don't have to agree with the present administration's policy in order to be a patriot, and some people think I do.
Well, when we landed at 6th of June in '43 in France, or then the ones we had were when we landed in the Philippines, because it taken us back, it would be against the Japanese then, because the Philippines was one of our islands, a territory. We had to take that back and relieve all those people, because they have 5 islands that's in the Philippines.
I think Eisenhower's plan to go into France in the first place and I think that was the smart thing to do, and actually in a way it went pretty smooth except for the Battle of the Bulge, where it was winter time and we kind of backed off a little bit, and that was when they decided to make the Battle of the Bulge by going through that in that kind of weather, and then the Americans and the Allies, they were hit pretty hard up in there. But we weren't, because we were south of there.
And then this picture was given to me by George Marquardt, who flew Necessary Evil in the photoplane that took this picture from 30 miles away at 30,000 feet. And this picture was reproduced in 1995 for these 3 crews. This is Major Chuck Sweeney. This was Colonel Paul Tibbets, and this was Captain George Marquardt, the 3 crews that flew on the very first atomic bomb drop over Hiroshima. And this cloud, the atomic cloud, was already 80,000 feet high, and at 30 miles away, and they're at 30,000 feet. And their signatures here, along with the description, were on the back of this picture. I copied it because I didn't want to destroy the original, and this was on the back of the photograph also. This shows the Great Artiste, the Enola Gay, and Necessary Evil. And then this is Little Boy Bomb, and this is Fat Man. Little Boy was 10 feet long, 28 inches in diameter, and it exploded over over Hiroshima at an altitude of 1,750 feet, and it weighed 8,900 pounds, and it exploded with a force of 13 kilotons of force. That's 26 million pounds of TNT, and that was on August the 6th, 1945, and that 13 kilotons is 26 million tons, equivalent to 26 million tons of TNT. The plutonium bomb, on the other hand, was 5 feet in diameter, and it was 10 feet 6 inches long, 10,800 pounds, and it exploded with a force of 23 kilotons. That's 46 million pounds of TNT. 3 days later, on August the 9th, over Nagasaki, and it dropped to an altitude of 1,750 feet, and it exploded. I already told you the force there, but it went about 50 feet lower than the other bomb. 43. It took 43 seconds for these bombs to drop to that altitude, and the planes had to be 8 miles away, and they made a 155-degree turn and dived 1,000 feet and had to be 8 miles away to avoid being taken down by those blasts. These 4 crews, some of the crews flew twice, but only one man was on board the plane that carried the bomb, and that was Jacob Beeser, the guy who was in charge of the radar that actually set the bomb off. On the 19th bounce of a radar set off by Jacob Beeser, on the 19th bounce, that's what actually triggered the bomb. So that's just a brief description of these pictures here.
But it was an interesting thing to go through. I wouldn't want to do it again, but I'm glad I got to help serve and did my duty.
We had a good time in Australia, training down there, and of course things changed as we moved to New Guinea, the jungles, that's what it was, and then to the Philippines, and finally to Hiroshima. But it was all interesting.
I really have an appreciation for all these people that I've interviewed, and more to go. I've still got a lengthy list of people to contact and see if they will come in for an interview. Some of them don't want to, and I respect that, because it is painful for them to recall some of these things. It's private, but I do get along well with them since I was a combat veteran. And so they're willing to talk and open up with me where they might not be willing to talk to some others who don't have the background. So I've appreciated the fact that I was in a position to be able to appreciate what they were telling me on their level. I've been there, done that. So, and I think that's the way they looked at me. And there's some great guys out there.
I was there last year at the time of its dedication. Like all veterans, we got an opportunity to contribute since our name was on a mailing list. And I thought it was unfortunate we had not had a World War II memorial, so I put some dollars into to its construction. And so I continued on the mailing list, and so knowing that the memorial was nearing completion, I wanted to visit it. And so my wife was not physically able to go. My daughter lives in Richmond, Virginia. So I asked her and my grandson to go with me to the dedication of the memorial. Now, the amount of money that I gave did not get me one of the better seats. But we sat out in a field just near the Vietnam Memorial, and we saw all of the ceremony on television screens that were before us. It was wonderfully organized, and very moving moment for me as an individual. And then after the memorial service was over, we then got our chance to visit the memorial itself. And it's really quite breathtaking to know what its purpose is and to know that it's going to be there in perpetuity, memorializing those who served and those who gave their lives in World War II. And if you ever get to Washington, D.C., it's a worthwhile thing to see. Just as you ever get to Chicago, it's worthwhile to go by the Museum of Science and Industry and see the 505 and hear its story.
Oh, I think it's great. Yeah, I think it's great. I think it was too long in coming, really. World War II was a very important win for us, no doubt about that. And the Vietnam situation, I'm sure that's great to have that also. But there was so much, I don't know, the Vietnam veterans made such a fuss over it. They got a memorial before we did. But no doubt it was justified in having it as well. But I think it's great to have this one too.
It's beautiful, and it memorializes everybody that was there.
I haven't been there. I've talked to some people who have been. It was a long time in coming, long overdue. But I understand attendance was great there. Do you have any information in that regard? But people from here travel there for it, for the dedication of it. And I understand they were very impressed. But I think it's a great thing. It finally recognizes the contribution these people made to the United States and to the world in World War II.
War is hell. That's about the only thing I can say. And we shouldn't be involved in it unless it was absolutely necessary.
I think we need to learn that America needs to keep a strong military, and we know that during the Cold War that we had the SAC airplanes constantly in the air. We had the B-36s that could carry atomic bombs, and Russia was certainly aware of that, and we had the atomic bomb before they did as well. So I think that's the one important thing we need to learn, that a strong military, it has to be considered.
What we've learned today is that we cannot police the whole world. We've got to be able to live with everybody else and be able to get along.
Well, I tell you what I learned. After I worked at Westinghouse, and we had licensees all over the world. And I got to know Japanese people and German people, every nationality, I guess. And I found out that all those people were no different than I am. Heinz Grunska came from Siemens Schuckers out of Berlin, Germany, and he fought the Russians. And he was at our house, and we had our little daughter, and we'd say, "How big?" And she'd say, "So big." And he said, "We do the same thing with our little boy." And we had a man by the name of Shunito. He came over from Japan, and we had him in our house for dinner and everything. And I found out these men were no different than I am, and their families are no different. And I don't think it's the average person that wants to fight. To me, our governments, maybe they have to do what they do, but to me, we have to learn how to negotiate other than war, because everybody loses in a war.
About the basic thing that you could learn is that we don't want any more wars if we can keep out of them.
I guess the whole idea of how to live in a democratic world is that sometimes if necessary you have to go to war, I suppose. I think it's the last resort, personally. But what did I learn? I think you learned that we have a pretty darn good country, a wonderful country. We got all the benefits in the world here.
I think the world finally woke up to the fact that democracy is the way people should be governed. Of course, we've been governing ourselves ever since the country has been here. but it's new to a lot of people. But like I say, now all countries now, a lot of them are coming to our form of government, and that's fine. As long as you got democratic form of government, you're not going to have so many wars.
Well, I think they should never forget it. That's the main thing you should. But we seem to forget, because we keep thinking we're going to remedy it by a war, but it doesn't seem to be very effective.
Well, I think that we must keep a loyal, all the kids must have a very loyal love for our country. And everybody does, almost as you. If you heard the president last night, did you? Yeah. He mentioned that too. And so whenever you get up and making your money and everything, you need to support the organizations that support that thing, you know. And you'll get into that sometime on there. And I've been involved with that a little bit too, but that's a different story altogether. I'm not a hero by any stretch of the imagination. A lot of the guys were, but I was not. I just did my job.
Well, I think the world changed because of World War II, because it was like the Romans, that they tried to take over the world. That's what Hitler was trying to do. He was trying to take over the world, and he had to be stopped. And he was also putting to death a lot of Jews, and the Jewish people was a chosen person within the whole world, and that had to be stopped too.
Just don't let it happen again. But the way things are now, who knows? Nobody in the world is safe. If things go wrong, somebody's going to try to straighten it out.
I hope you don't ever have to face the chore of being drafted and going to fight. There's no way that you can keep that from happening if we don't have peace in the world. We haven't hardly had peace since World War II.
Oh, I think patriotism and working together and sacrifice for the good of someone else and loyalty, all of those things.
I don't know. I'm afraid they don't learn a lot from any war. But that's just my own philosophy.
I just think they were misguided and misinformed and not living to their own inner values. Somebody else was leading them. Now, I think we all have to watch ourselves to think that we're not being influenced by somebody else's mind. And I think if we have our own inner convictions, that you won't be following somebody that's likely to lead you astray. But we all do stop thinking for ourselves at a certain degree, I think, in many areas of our living.
What they should learn about World War II, they should learn why it happened. What were the situations that caused us to go to war? They should learn that it was a kind of a total experience, and it wasn't only the military branches and their support services, but the civilian population at home during the war who made great contributions, and women worked in industries to support the war, and the people bought war bonds. They sacrificed by not being able to have gasoline very much, and other types of rationing. I think maybe once sugar was rationed, I'm not sure. So that people ought to learn what is involved in war, and they ought to learn that, and they bought war bonds, as I said. They ought to learn that, what is the real cost of war, and also they ought to learn, is there any, what is the results of war? And personally, wars breed more wars. And I have become a pacifist.
Something called ego defense mechanisms. People who have had things done to them and they haven't been able to cope with it, and they end up doing it to someone else. And after World War II, they started a mental health program. Carl Menninger was in charge of psychological services in World War II. And he found out we had thousands of men who couldn't get in service because they didn't have a proper diet, emaciated. A lot of them were discharged prematurely because of physical breakdown and mental breakdown. And so he says at least one meal a day, kids will get a decent meal. That's the reason you have food programs in school.
Well, if they would study it and learn how to get along, it would make a lot of difference.
I think they can learn a whole lot from it by studying how things went and whatnot. They can more or less, it'll explain to them how other people in different parts of the world look at it. And I think it's very interesting. I think everyone should study it, not study it, but learn more about it.
And there has to be a different way to settle differences. To me, probably one of the greatest things to prevent war, or at least to make people think a little bit more, is educate people. I think people are taught to hate each other not when they're little children. I mean, little children will play with each other and everything else. When they grow older, that's when they get prejudiced against other people. And I think you have to teach people that you can't do it.
Because of the European theater and the atrocities that Hitler's people did, conquering them first and then moving to Japan, or the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater, and then conquering the Japanese for the assault on Pearl Harbor. Actually, it set the world free of those two. They call them the Axis. So I think without doubt it was a great victory for the world.
I will never regret ever going. It was one of the greatest experiences, the most horrible things you see, but the most beautiful things you see. And you have the greatest soul growth. Sometimes when you are close to people and you love them for, you don't know their backgrounds, you don't know anything about them, you like them for who they are and not what they have. And I think that's one of the richest experiences you can have.
What I would like is, don't forget your history, because it'll repeat itself over and over and over.
Well, I think your people from your age can learn not only from World War II, but from other wars that we fought, that it's occasionally necessary for people to have to sacrifice to maintain the freedoms which they now have. They were not automatically given to us, not at any age or in any stage of life. And they have to be protected, because there are people in this world who would take them away from us. And so you have to recognize what's important to you. And having recognized this, is it then worth the fight to keep it? In my age, in my generation's time, it was the preservation of a society that was working against the totalitarianism of Hitler and Mussolini and the terrible things about which they brought upon the world. There have been other times since that time. Not all wars are just. Not all wars are worthy. But there are times when we must stand up and be counted, and you have to determine, you and your generation, when that time is.
met the man who might have thrown the potato masher, were you able to forgive him what he might have done?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was there, same reason that I was there. I don't hold it against him. He was doing his duty, so was I. So we had no words or anything. In fact, we wrote letters. I've wrote letters to him since then. He's answered them. I had to get an interpreter every time because I can't read German. He's the same way with American, but he wrote some. We've had some correspondence that has been worthy. So, no, there's no animosity at all.
And you were able to become friends with him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We eat with him. We had a meal with he and his wife. After that, even a personal meal. I'm a Christian, and the Bible says you forgive your enemies.
The German people were fine, I think.
Would you be able to forgive the people that killed? That
Oh, yeah.
interviewed,
Well,
that
yeah.
killed many of your friends and
Well,
comrades?
well, I reckon, yeah. Of course, I don't figure that they did it because they wanted to, because they had to. Either they had to kill or get killed themselves.
Yes, of course, because we do the same thing. We don't think, we don't evaluate. And if we don't have forgiveness, we're never going to get anywhere, any place, because we have to expand. If we're going to improve the world, we have to improve our own consciousness towards what's going on and keep your faith.
Forgive them?
Have you forgiven them?
Absolutely. I have forgiven every soul in the universe. I had to when I became a preacher.
As I got to the conclusion of forgiving Mengele, I made a sweep of, if I forgive Mengele, I might as well forgive everybody. He was the worst of the worst in my eyes. And it was an interesting conclusion, because as long as you have some enemies or some people that you have feelings against, you are still dealing in the mentality of a victim. And I said, well, if I can forgive Mengele, I might as well forgive everybody. And it was a very important conclusion, because that really what gives you the complete freedom.
So, has our documentary opened your eyes to America's past? Our true goal is to point out that America's heroes are not just Eisenhower, Patton, and Audie Murphy, but the everyday citizen who felt it was their duty to serve their country. Thank you for watching this segment, and please thank any veteran you know for their role in preserving our freedom.